Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle back, perhaps pull a soft blanket closer, and allow your mind to drift into the narrow, timber-framed streets of 17th century London. The Great Fire of London was not merely a disaster, it was a transformation, a violent rebirth that would reshape one of the world's great cities. Imagine yourself walking through the London of 1666, where houses leaned so close together that neighbors could shake hands from their upper windows. The streets are narrow ribbons of packed earth and refuse, barely wide enough for a cart to pass. Timber and pitch, wattle and dauber, very bones of the city, are kindling, waiting for a spark. In this medieval labyrinth, fire is both servant and master, providing warmth and light while threatening constant destruction. If you want to help me to keep doing these videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the like button. It motivates and helps me keep bringing videos in this format. If you'd like to hear about a specific topic, leave a comment below. I'll show you in the video when your topic is chosen. You awaken in the pre-dawn darkness of September 2nd, 1666. Not to the gentle chiming of church bells, but to shouts echoing through the narrow passages outside your timber-framed dwelling. The acrid smell of smoke creeps through the gaps in your shutters, and as you push them open, the orange glow dancing against the walls of neighboring houses tells you everything. Fire has come to London, and it moves with the hunger of a living thing, devouring the dry wooden bones of your medieval city. Your heart pounds as you realize that in this labyrinth of narrow streets and overhanging upper stories, escape will not be a matter of simply walking out your front door. The very architecture that has sheltered generations of Londoners has become a trap, each jutting beam and thatched roof a stepping stone for the flames. The fire began, as you would later learn, in Thomas Farriner's bakehouse on Pudding Lane, where the ovens that fed the city's hunger for bread became the spark that would consume it. But in these first moments of awakening terror, such details matter little. What matters is the growing roar that seems to come from everywhere at once, the sound of timber crackling and collapsing, of glass shattering in the heat, of thousands of voices raised in panic and prayer. You dress hastily in the dim light, your fingers fumbling with unfamiliar urgency over the ties and buttons of your everyday clothes. These garments, woven from wool and linen, carry the scent of your daily life, the smoky residue of your own hearth, the faint mustiness of storage chests, the lingering aromas of yesterday's meals. Stepping into the street, you are immediately struck by the organized chaos that has erupted around you. Neighbors you have known for years move like strangers, their faces transformed by fear in the strange, dancing light of the approaching flames. The narrow passage that leads from your door to the main thoroughfare is clogged with people, each clutching whatever possessions they deemed most precious in those first moments of realization. A woman passes, carrying a heavy oak chest, her face streaked with tears and soot, while behind her, a man struggles with a load of rolled fabrics, the fruits of his merchant trade reduced to what his arms can bear. Children cling to their parents' hands, their eyes wide with an excitement they do not yet understand will turn to terror. The heat reaches you before the flames do, rolling down the street in waves that make the air shimmer and dance. It carries with it a cocktail of scents that speak of destruction, the sweet, cloying smell of burning sugar from a confectioner's shop, the sharp tang of melting lead from window casements, the choking thickness of burning wool and leather. Your throat begins to burn, and you pull your cloak up to cover your nose and mouth, but the cloth offers little protection against the increasingly poisonous air. The smoke is not the clean, white vapor of a hearth fire, but a dense, yellow-brown cloud that seems to grab at your lungs with greedy fingers, making each breath a conscious effort. As you join the river of humanity flowing through the streets, you begin to understand the true nature of your predicament. This is not a fire that can be fought with the leather buckets and simple pumps that serve as London's fire protection. This is something altogether different, a force that seems to mock human efforts at control. The Lord Mayor himself, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was reportedly dismissive when first told of the blaze, claiming that a woman might piss it out. But now, as the flames leap from building to building with impossible speed, his words seem not merely foolish, but tragically naive. The fire moves like a living creature, following the wind and feeding on the abundance of fuel that centuries of construction have provided. The streets themselves become rivers of terror and confusion. Pudding Lane, where it all began, is already lost, consumed so thoroughly that those who knew it as a bustling center of trade and daily life will struggle to recognize its charred remains. Fish Street Hill becomes a corridor of flame, the rising ground seeming to lift the fire toward heaven itself. The ancient timber buildings, some dating back centuries, surrender to the flames with what seems like resignation, their oak beams and plaster walls offering no more resistance than kindling in a hearth. You watch in fascination and horror as a house you passed just moments ago erupts into full flame. The fire bursting from its windows like the breath of some monstrous dragon awakening from sleep. The cobblestones beneath your feet radiate heat, and you realize with growing alarm that the fire has found its way into the very foundations of the city. Cellars that stored wine and oil have become furnaces, and the underground passages that carry London's modest water supply offer no refuge but merely new pathways for the flames to explore. Your shoes, leather-soled and practical for the normal rhythms of city life, begin to feel inadequate against the increasingly hot stones. The soles grow warm, then uncomfortably hot, and you understand that lingering too long in any one place will mean more than discomforted, will mean injury, perhaps death. Around you, the desperate mathematics of survival play out in countless small dramas. A family argues over whether to return for a forgotten chest of silver. The husband pulling toward safety while his wife gestures frantically toward their abandoned home, now crowned with fingers of flame reaching toward the leaden sky. An elderly man sits on his bundle of possessions, too exhausted to continue, while strangers debate whether they can spare the strength to help him. A young mother clutches her infant while trying to manage two other children, her face a mask of determination that barely conceals her growing desperation. These are the moments when the comfortable social structures of daily life dissolve, when neighbor may abandon neighbor, when survival becomes the only law that matters. The noise is overwhelming, a symphony of destruction that assaults your ears from every direction. There is the deep, hungry roar of the flames themselves, punctuated by the sharp crack of beams snapping under the intense heat. Glass windows explode outward in showers of glittering fragments that catch the firelight like falling stars. Heavy timbers crash to the ground with sounds like thunder, sending up clouds of sparks that dance in the superheated air before settling like deadly snow on everything they touch. And threading through it all are the human sound screams of terror and pain, shouts of desperate coordination, the crying of children, the prayers of those who have given up all hope except in divine intervention. You realize that the Thames, London's great river and highway, has become the city's only hope of salvation. The wooden wharves that line its banks are already burning, their timber structures offering no more resistance to the flames than the houses that crowd the narrow streets. But the river itself remains inviolate, its dark waters promising safety for those who can reach them. The problem is getting there alive. Between you and salvation lie streets that have become furnaces, passages blocked by fallen timber, and panicked crowds. In the ever-present danger of buildings collapsing without warning as their wooden skeletons surrender to the heat. Your progress toward the Thames becomes a series of calculated risks and desperate choices. Streets that were familiar pathways through your neighborhood have become alien landscapes of flame and smoke. The Church of St. Magnus, the Martyr, where, You have heard countless sermons, stands wreathed in fire, its ancient stones cracking in the heat. The spire that has guided your steps for years now serves as a beacon of destruction, visible through the smoke as a tower of flame reaching toward the heavens. You watch other refugees make the same calculations you are making, weighing known routes against unknown dangers, familiar streets against the terror of the unknown. As you finally reach the Thames, the river that has been London's lifeline for over 1,000 years becomes your personal salvation. The water is black and choppy, crowded with boats of every description as watermen work desperately to ferry refugees to safety on the far bank. The familiar sounds of the river, the splash of oars, creaking of boat holes, the calls of boatmen provide a strange comfort after the chaos of the burning streets. But even here, safety is relative. The heat from the burning city turns, the air above the water shimmering and unstable, and debris from collapsed buildings floats past like the remnants of civilization itself. You understand that you have escaped, but London, as you knew it, is dying before your eyes, its medieval heart consumed in 4 days of flame that will reshape not just the physical city, the very character of English urban life forever. Standing on the relatively safe southern bank of the Thames, you join thousands of other refugees in witnessing the complete transformation of your world. The sun has risen fully now, though its light struggles to penetrate the thick pall of smoke that hangs over the city like a burial shroud. From this vantage point, you can see the true scope of the catastrophe unfolding before you. The fire has spread beyond Pudding Lane, beyond Fish Street Hill, consuming entire parishes with an appetite that seems to grow with each passing hour. The familiar skyline of church spires and guild halls is disappearing before your eyes, replaced by columns of smoke and flame that reach toward heaven like the prayers of a city in its death throes. The Thames itself has become a highway of desperation, its usually orderly traffic replaced by chaos as every available vessel is pressed into service for evacuation. Wherries that normally carry passengers for a few pence now demand whatever payment desperate refugees can offer. Lighters designed for cargo strain under the weight of families and their hastily gathered possessions. Even the great barges that usually transport goods to and from the London docks have been commandeered. Their holds filled with human cargo, fleeing the inferno. The watermen, those hardy souls who have made their living from the river for generations, work with grim determination, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes red from smoke, ferrying load after load of refugees to whatever safety the far bank can provide. You watch as entire neighborhoods disappear in what seems like moments. The steel yard, that ancient trading post of the German merchants, erupts in flames that reach so high they seem to threaten the very clouds. The smell of burning spices and exotic goods carried by the wind tells the story of international commerce reduced to ash and memory. Cheapside, that great commercial artery where London's merchants have displayed their wares for centuries, becomes a river of flame flowing eastward toward the Tower. The Royal Exchange, that monument to English commercial power, stands for a time like an island in a sea of fire before it succumbs, its stone walls cracking in the heat, its wooden interiors providing fresh fuel for the insatiable flames. The refugees around you represent every level of London society, their usual distinctions of rank and wealth temporarily erased by shared catastrophe. Merchants who yesterday commanded respect and deference now sit on bundles of salvaged goods, their fine clothes singed and torn, their faces bearing the same expression of shocked disbelief worn by the humblest apprentice. Gentlewomen who have never walked farther than their parish church find themselves trudging through mud and ash, their silk shoes ruined, their elaborate coiffures disheveled by smoke and panic. Children who have never seen beyond their own narrow streets now stand witness to the destruction of the only world they have ever known. The stories that circulate through the crowd of refugees carry the weight of tragedy and the strange. relief that comes from survival. A baker weeps as he recounts watching his shop, his livelihood, his family's legacy of 3 generations disappear in minutes. A goldsmith clutches a small bag of coins and jewelry, all that remains of a fortune built over decades of careful trade. A widow describes how her neighbors helped her escape with her children, only to see those same neighbors trapped as a building collapsed, blocking their path to safety. These are the human mathematics of disaster. Who lives? Who dies? Who escapes with their possessions intact? And who must begin again with nothing but the clothes on their backs? From your position on the south bank, you can observe the fire's relentless progress with a mixture of fascination and horror. The flames seem to possess an intelligence, seeking out the most combustible materials, following the wind patterns that carry burning debris to fresh fuel. Sparks and burning fragments fly across streets that would normally serve as fire breaks, landing on thatched roofs and timber walls with deadly accuracy. The fire leaps from building to building like a living thing, and you begin to understand that this is not merely an accident of overturned candles or careless baking. This is a perfect storm of conditions that has turned London into a vast tinderbox waiting for ignition. Heat reaches you even across the width of the Thames, making the air shimmer and dance above the water. Your clothes, already stained with soot and ash from your escape, began to feel uncomfortably warm despite the September morning air. The smell is overwhelming, and complex burning wood and thatch mixed with more exotic scents as the contents of shops and warehouses add their unique signatures to the smoke. There is the sweet, cloying smell of burning sugar from confectioners' shops, the acrid temps of melting metals from smiths' forges, the bitter smoke of burning leather from cobblers and tanners, and underneath it all, the increasingly frequent and terrible smell of burning flesh, as those who could not escape in time fall victim to the flames. The sound carries across the water with frightening clarity. The roar of the fire itself is constant now, deep rumble punctuated by the crash of falling timbers and the explosive crack of stones splitting in the heat. Church bells, those familiar voices that have marked the hours and seasons of London life, now toll in frantic, discordant patterns as bell ringers struggle to warn neighborhoods in the fire's path. Some bells fall silent as the wooden supports of their towers burn through, their bronze voices stilled forever. Others ring out their death songs as the towers themselves collapse, the ancient bronze crashing to earth with sounds that seem to announce the end of the medieval world. You notice how the fire creates its own weather, drawing air toward itself with such force that the wind patterns over the Thames shift and change. Debris, just ash and sparks, but larger fragments of buildings flies through the air like missiles. A piece of burning thatch lands in the river near your feet, hissing as the water extinguishes it. Charred papers, perhaps accounting records, or personal letters, drift down like snow, their words and numbers rendered meaningless by flame. The very air seems to thicken with smoke and heat, making each breath a conscious effort and causing the weaker refugees to cough, and gasp for clean air that becomes increasingly scarce as the hours pass. You begin to comprehend the true scale of what is being lost. This is not merely the destruction of buildings, though thousands of homes and shops are turning to ash before your eyes. This is the obliteration of a way of life that has existed for centuries. The narrow, winding streets where craftsmen have practiced their trades, where merchants have conducted business, where families have lived and loved and died for generations. Of this is disappearing in clouds of smoke and showers of sparks. The guild halls, where London's trades have been organized and regulated since medieval times, stand now as burning monuments to traditions that may never be rebuilt. The refugees around you begin to organize themselves with the natural hierarchy that emerges from disaster. Those with boats or carts become leaders by virtue of their mobility. Those with money or connections start to make plans for temporary shelter and eventual rebuilding. Those with neither face the grim reality of dependence on charity and goodwill. Children who have been separated from their parents wander through the crowd, right? Their cries adding another layer of tragedy to an already overwhelming catastrophe. Elderly refugees, exhausted by their escape, sit on their bundles of possessions with the resigned expressions of those who understand they may not live to see their city rebuilt. The Tower of London, that ancient fortress that has guarded the eastern approach to the city for 6 centuries, becomes a beacon of hope and a symbol of resistance against the flames. Its stone walls and trained garrison represent the kind of organized response that the rest of the city lacks. Soldiers work to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the fire's path, while the towers cannon fire explosive charges to bring down structures before the flames can reach them. The sight of these controlled demolitions provides some comfort to the watching refugees. Finally, human intelligence and planning are being brought to bear against the seemingly unstoppable force of the fire. Yet, even as you watch these efforts, you understand that they may be too little, too late. The fire has grown beyond a point where traditional firefighting methods can contain it. The leather buckets and hand-pumped engines that served adequately for ordinary house fires are laughably inadequate against this monster. The fire has developed its own momentum, its own logic, drawing fresh air to feed its hunger and creating wind. Patterns that spread burning debris far beyond the reach of any bucket brigade. The city that has grown organically over centuries, streets following ancient paths, its buildings crowded together for warmth and security, has become the perfect fuel for its own destruction. As the second day of the fire dawns, September 3rd, 1666, you realize that what you witnessed yesterday was merely the beginning of London's torment. The flames have spread with demonic persistence through the night, consuming entire wards that seemed safely distant just hours ago. From your position among the refugees on the South Bank, you watch in horrified fascination as the fire begins to reveal its true ambition. Not merely to burn individual buildings or neighborhoods, but to devour the very heart of English civilization. The medieval city that has stood for centuries, that has survived plagues and invasions, royal displeasure and religious upheaval, now faces an enemy that recognizes no authority, respects no tradition, and shows no mercy to the accumulated treasures of human endeavor. The wind, which yesterday seemed merely an unfortunate circumstance, has become the fire's most faithful ally. It blows from the east with increasing strength, pushing the flames westward toward the very centers of London's power and wealth. The narrow streets that once provided shelter and intimacy now function as channels directing the fire's appetite toward fresh fuel. Every timber-framed building, every thatched roof, every wooden shutter and door becomes part of an endless feast that grows more ravenous with each passing hour. The fire moves not like a natural phenomenon, but like a conquering army, systematic in its destruction, relentless in its advance, leaving nothing but ash and memory in its wake. You observe how the fire transforms the familiar geography of your city, into an alien landscape. Cornhill, that ancient marketplace where Londoners have traded for over a millennium, disappears beneath a wall of flame that seems to reach toward the very clouds. The Royal Exchange, Sir Thomas Gresham's monument to English commercial power, stands for hours like a defiant fortress against the approaching inferno. Its stone construction and grand architecture seem for a time to offer hope that some structures might survive, that the fire might finally meet its match in human engineering and ambition. But as you watch, the wooden fittings inside begin to burn, and the stone itself starts to crack and split in the intense heat. When the roof finally collapses, sending a shower of sparks hundreds of feet into the air, you understand that nothing in London is safe, that no building, however grand or solidly constructed, can withstand this supernatural hunger for destruction. The human drama, playing out around you on the riverbank, becomes increasingly complex as more refugees arrive with each passing hour. Entire parishes empty themselves into the temporary camps that spring up on whatever open ground can be found. Moorfields, normally a place for recreation and military exercises, becomes a vast refugee settlement where London's displaced citizens huddle around small fires. The irony of seeking comfort from flames while fleeing the greatest fire in their city's history lost on none. The social hierarchies that normally govern London life begin to break down under the pressure of shared catastrophe. Merchants find themselves sleeping beside their former servants, all united by the common experience of loss and the uncertain hope of survival. The boats that continue to ferry refugees across the Thames carry increasingly desperate cargo. Yesterday's evacuees brought their most precious possessions: silver plate, important documents, family heirlooms passed down through generations. Today's refugees carry whatever they could grab in moments of terror: a child's wooden toy, a pot for cooking, a change of clothes. Tomorrow's evacuees, you realize with growing dread, may carry nothing but their lives, if they are fortunate enough to escape at all. The river itself begins to change color. Its normally dark waters taking on an oily sheen from the ash and debris that falls like snow from the burning city. Dead fish float belly up, killed by the heat and pollution, while the water near the banks grows warm enough to be uncomfortable to the touch. From across the river comes a constant symphony of destruction that seems to emanate from the very bowels of the earth. The roar of the flames has grown so loud and constant that normal conversation becomes impossible. Refugees must shout to be heard above the din. Church bells, those ancient voices that have called Londoners to prayer for centuries, ring out in cacophonous alarm as their bell ringers attempt to warn neighborhoods still in the fire's path. But one by one, these voices fall silent as the wooden towers that house them surrender to the flames. The great bell of Bow Church, whose sound has traditionally marked the boundaries of true London citizenship, tolls its final notes before crashing to earth in a shower of sparks and molten bronze that illuminates the smoke-filled sky like a falling star. The destruction of London's churches carries a particular horror that transcends mere material loss. These are not simply buildings, but repositories of community memory, places where generations of families have celebrated births, mourned deaths, and marked the passage of their lives. St. Bartholomew's, where your own parents were married, disappears in flames that seem to mock the sacred vows once spoken within its walls. St. Mildred's, where you were baptized as an infant, becomes a pillar of fire that burns so intensely the lead in its windows melts and runs down the stone walls like tears. St. Paul's Cathedral, that ancient monument to faith and royal power, stands increasingly isolated as the fire consumes the buildings around it, leaving the great church like an island in a sea of flame. Its survival becoming a test of divine will against earthly destruction. The heat across the river has become so intense that it affects even the weather, creating its own wind patterns and causing the air above the burning city to shimmer and dance like water. Refugees are forced to move farther back from the riverbank as the radiant heat makes the air itself uncomfortable to breathe. Your clothes, despite being on the wrong side of a river nearly 200 yards wide, grow warm against your skin. The metal buttons on your coat become too hot to touch comfortably, and the leather of your shoes begins to feel uncomfortably warm. Around you, other refugees fan themselves with whatever materials they can find, their faces flushed and sweating despite the September air that should provide relief from summer's heat. The fire demonstrates an almost intelligent malevolence in its choice of targets, seeming to seek out the most irreplaceable treasures of London's accumulated wealth and culture. The Guildhall, that center of London's civic life where the city's government has met for centuries, burns with particular fury, its ancient timbers providing spectacular fuel for flames that seem to celebrate the destruction of human authority and organization. The libraries within, containing centuries of records, laws, and accumulated wisdom, become nothing more than fodder for the insatiable hunger of the fire. Thousands of books, manuscripts, and documents that represent the intellectual heritage of the nation disappear in minutes. Their knowledge and wisdom transformed into ash that floats away on the wind like scattered thoughts. The warehouses along the Thames, filled with goods from across the known world, provide the fire with an international banquet of destruction. Spices from the Indies burn with aromatic smoke that mingles strangely with the acrid smell of burning timber. Silks from China shrivel and disappear in moments, their beauty and craftsmanship reduced to wisps of colored ash. Sugar from the Caribbean colonies melts and caramelizes, creating a sickly, sweet smell that provides a nauseating counterpoint to the more familiar sense of burning wood and cloth. Wine from France and Spain boils in their casks, creating explosive bursts of flame as the alcohol ignites, sending jets of fire shooting through warehouse windows like the breath of dragons. Awakening from ancient sleep, the psychological impact of witnessing such complete destruction begins to tell on the refugees gathered around you. Men who have built successful businesses over decades of careful work sit in stunned silence, staring at the flames that have consumed their life's labor in hours. Women who have carefully maintained homes and raised families in neighborhoods now reduced to ash heap quietly while trying to comfort. Children who ask questions no adult can answer. The elderly whose memories span generations and who have seen their share of trials shake their heads in bewilderment at a catastrophe that exceeds anything in their experience. Even the clergy, those men trained to find divine purpose in earthly suffering, struggle to explain how a just God could permit such comprehensive destruction of his faithful servants' labors. As night falls on this second day, the fire has grown so large and intense that it creates its own illumination, turning the September darkness into an eerie twilight painted in shades of orange and red. The smoke columns that rise from different parts of the burning city merge into a vast pall that blots out the stars and seems to press down on the earth like a lid on a vast furnace. The reflection of the flames on the Thames turns the river into a flowing mirror of fire, creating the illusion that the entire world has been consumed by this single catastrophe. Sleep becomes impossible for most refugees, not only because of the noise and heat, but because of the hypnotic horror of watching their entire world transform before their eyes. The fire's appetite seems to grow with feeding, and you begin to understand that this is not merely an accident, but a perfect convergence of circumstances that has created the ideal conditions for urban destruction. The long, dry summer has desiccated every piece of wood in the city, turning buildings into kindling. The strong eastern wind provides constant fresh oxygen to feed the flames and carries burning debris to ignite new fires faster than any human agency can control them. The narrow streets and overhanging upper stories of medieval London create perfect channels for the fire to travel, while the timber and pitch construction of most buildings provides an endless supply of fuel. What you are witnessing is not just a fire, but the perfect fire, a catastrophe so precisely calibrated to its environment that it seems almost supernatural in its efficiency and thoroughness. The human cost of the fire begins to manifest in ways beyond the immediate danger of burning. Elderly refugees, exhausted by their escape and the shock of losing everything they have spent lifetimes accumulating, simply sit down and refuse to move further, their eyes reflecting a resignation that speaks of spirits broken as completely as their material circumstances. Children, separated from parents in the chaos of evacuation, wander through the refugee camps calling names that may never be answered. Pregnant women, forced to flee in nightclothes, huddle around small fires, trying to stay warm while wondering where they will give birth to children who will inherit nothing but ash. The injured, burned by falling debris or trampled in the panic of evacuation, lie on rough blankets with wounds that would challenge physicians under the best of circumstances. Their suffering compounded by the impossible conditions of refugee life. Yet even in this catalog of loss and suffering, You observe moments of human nobility that shine like small lights in the surrounding darkness. Strangers share food and blankets with refugees who have lost everything. Watermen refuse payment from families with nothing left to give. Wealthy merchants who manage to save something of their fortunes organize relief efforts for those less fortunate. Children who have lost their own toys comfort other children who weep for parents who may never be found. These acts of kindness and solidarity, performed against the backdrop of absolute catastrophe, remind you that while the fire may destroy buildings and possessions, it cannot entirely consume the human capacity for compassion and mutual aid that makes civilization possible even in its darkest hours. In a comfortable chamber on Seething Lane, within the secure walls of the Navy office compound, Samuel Pepys awakens on the morning of September 2nd, 1666, to what he will later describe as some of our maids sitting up late last night to get things ready against our feast today. The feast he refers to is a dinner party planned for friends and colleagues, a typical social gathering for a man who has climbed from humble beginnings to become one of the most influential civil servants in England. At 33 years old, Pepys has established himself as clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board, a position that places him at the heart of England's maritime administration during a time when naval power determines national survival. His diary, which he has kept faithfully for over 6 years, records not just the grand events of state, but the intimate details of daily life in Restoration England, creating an unparalleled window into both the public and private worlds of 17th century London. The first intimation that this Sunday will be different from any other comes not through his windows, which face away from the fire's origin, but through the excited chatter of his household staff. Jane Birch, his longtime maid, brings word that there has been a fire somewhere in the city during the night. Though her account is vague and confused, Pepys, ever curious about events, both great and small, dresses with his usual care, his periwig properly arranged, his coat brushed, stockings straightened, ventures forth to investigate. His house on Seething Lane occupies a privileged position within the Navy office compound, protected by walls and gates that separate it from the common streets of London. This physical distance from the ordinary life of the city mirrors his social ascent from the son of a tailor to a gentleman who dines with peers and corresponds with the greatest minds of his age. Walking through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, Pepys observes the first signs that something extraordinary is occurring in the eastern districts of the city. The air carries an unusual haze, and the morning light has a peculiar quality that he struggles to identify. Small groups of people move with unusual purpose and urgency, their conversations animated by something more pressing than the typical concerns of Sunday morning. As he approaches the vicinity of Gracechurch Street, the smell of smoke becomes unmistakable, and he quickens his pace with the instinctive curiosity of a man whose profession has trained him to gather information, assess situations, and report accurately on developments that might affect the interests of the Crown and the efficiency of naval administration. Upon reaching a vantage point where he can observe the scene, Pepys experiences what he will later record as a moment of profound shock and recognition. This is not the aftermath of a simple house fire or even a serious conflagration affecting a few buildings. What spreads before his eyes is a disaster of unprecedented scope, with flames already consuming dozens of structures and showing no signs of abating. His trained administrative mind immediately begins to catalog details: the wind direction and strength, the types of buildings being consumed, the apparent speed of the fire's advance, the adequacy of the response from city authorities. These observations will prove invaluable not only for his diary, but for the official reports he will later prepare for his superiors in government. The professional habits that have made Pepys invaluable to the Navy Board is attention to detail, his systematic approach to complex problems, his ability to maintain clarity under pressure serve him well as he witnesses the fire's devastating progress, rather than being paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster. He positions himself where he can observe most effectively and begins the mental process of recording that will eventually produce one of the most important eyewitness accounts in English history. He notes the behavior of the flames, how they leap from building to building with what seems like intelligent purpose, seeking out the most combustible materials and following the wind patterns that carry burning debris to fresh fuel. From his initial observation point, Pepys can see that the fire has already moved far beyond its origin point in Pudding Lane, the narrow streets of the area around London. Bridge are filled with refugees carrying whatever possessions they could gather in their hasty flight. The social dynamics of the disaster fascinate him as much as its physical progress. He observes how quickly the normal hierarchies of London life dissolve under the pressure of shared catastrophe, how merchants and servants find themselves equally reduced to the status of refugees, how the comfortable certainties of daily routine evaporate in the face of immediate physical danger. His position within the government service gives Pepys access to information and perspectives unavailable to ordinary citizens, and he uses these connections to build a comprehensive understanding of the fire's development through conversations with other officials, reports from messengers, and his own systematic observations. He begins to piece together a narrative that encompasses not just what is happening, but why it is happening and what it might mean for the future of London and England. His diary entries during these days will reflect this multi-layered understanding, combining personal emotion with professional analysis, immediate observation with long-term perspective. The fire's approach toward more significant landmarks provides Pepys with opportunities to observe how different types of construction respond to the flames. He watches with particular interest as the fire reaches buildings of stone construction, noting how even these more substantial structures prove vulnerable when their wooden interiors and furnishings provide fuel for the increasingly intense heat. The Royal Exchange, that symbol of London's commercial power, captures his attention as it stands temporarily defiant against the advancing flames. When it finally succumbs, the collapse provides him with insights into the fire's power that will inform both his immediate reporting and his later reflections on the disaster's significance. Throughout these observations, Pepys maintains the emotional equilibrium that has characterized his approach to other crises during his career. While he is clearly moved by the human suffering he witnesses, he does not allow emotion to cloud his analytical faculties or compromise his ability to record events accurately. This professional detachment, combined with his natural sympathy for human suffering, creates a unique perspective that captures both the grand sweep of historical events and the intimate details of individual experience. His diary becomes a bridge between the public and private dimensions of the disaster, showing how great events affect ordinary people while revealing how individual responses contribute to the larger historical narrative. The systematic nature of Pepys's observations extends to his analysis of the authorities' response to the crisis. As a government official himself, he is particularly interested in how different levels of administration react to an emergency of this magnitude. He notes the initial complacency of the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth's dismissive attitude toward the fire's early stages will become legendary for its tragic short-sightedness. He observes the gradual mobilization of more effective responses as the scope of the disaster becomes undeniable, including the eventual involvement of the Duke of York and other members of the royal family in directing firefighting efforts. The fire's impact on London's commercial life provides Pepys with material for reflections that extend far beyond immediate disaster reporting. As clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board, he understands better than most how the destruction of London's commercial infrastructure will affect England's ability to maintain its naval forces and compete with European rivals. The warehouses burning along the Thames contain not just private merchandise, but materials essential to national defense: timber for ship construction, iron for cannon, rope and canvas for rigging and sails. The destruction he witnesses represents not just individual tragedy, but a potential threat to English security and prosperity that will require years to remedy. His observations of the fire's behavior lead Pepys to insights about urban planning and construction that will prove prophetic for London's eventual rebuilding. He notes how the narrow streets and overhanging buildings that characterize medieval London contribute to the fire's rapid spread, creating channels that direct flames and wind patterns that carry burning debris to fresh fuel. His comments about the need for wider streets and more substantial construction methods anticipate many of the reforms that will be implemented during London's reconstruction under the direction of Christopher Wren and other architects committed to creating a more fire-resistant urban environment. The social dimensions of the disaster provide Pepys with opportunities to observe human nature under extreme stress, and his diary reflects both admiration for acts of courage and mutual aid, and concern about the breakdown of normal social controls. He notes instances of looting and profiteering alongside examples of selfless heroism and community solidarity. These observations reveal his understanding that disasters like the Great Fire serve as tests of social cohesion, revealing both the strengths and weaknesses of the communities they affect. His position within government gives him access to discussions about maintaining public order during the crisis, and his diary provides insights into how authorities balance the need for emergency measures with respect for individual rights and property. As the fire continues to spread throughout the second day, Pepys recognizes that he is witnessing not just a disaster, but a transformation that will reshape London physically, economically, and socially. His diary entries begin to reflect this longer-term perspective, moving beyond immediate reporting to consider what the fire's destruction might mean for London's future development. He speculates about rebuilding efforts, considers the economic impact of such comprehensive destruction, and reflects on how the fire might change the character of English urban life. These forward-looking observations demonstrate the historical consciousness that makes his diary valuable, not just as a record of events, but as a source of insight into the process of historical change itself. The personal impact of the fire on Pepys and his household provides a counterpoint to his professional observations, revealing how even those in relatively secure positions face uncertainty and anxiety during such comprehensive disasters. His concerns about the safety of his own home and possessions, his efforts to protect important papers and valuables, his arrangements for his wife's safety, all of these personal details humanize his account and remind readers that even the most detached observers are not immune to the emotional and practical challenges that disasters create. His diary captures the tension between professional duty and personal concern that characterizes the experience of public officials during times of crisis. As the fire enters its second day, Samuel Pepys demonstrates the methodical approach to crisis documentation that will make his diary one of history's most valuable primary sources. Rising early on September 3rd, he establishes a routine that balances his official duties with his compulsive need to witness and record the unfolding catastrophe. His house on Seething Lane becomes a command post from which he coordinates information gathering, official correspondence, and personal observation, creating a comprehensive record that encompasses everything from administrative details to intimate human moments. The discipline that has made him invaluable to the Navy Board now serves a different purpose, as he transforms himself into history's most reliable witness to London's greatest disaster. From his study window, Pepys can observe the fire's continued westward progress, and he begins each day by noting wind direction, weather conditions, and the visible extent of the flames. His naval training has taught him to read weather patterns and assess their implications for operations, skills that prove invaluable for understanding how atmospheric conditions feed the fire's hunger. He records not just what he sees, but what these observations suggest about the fire's likely path and intensity. The strong easterly wind that has blown consistently since the fire began appears to him not merely as a meteorological phenomenon, but as the driving force behind a disaster, whose scope grows with each passing hour. His position within the government bureaucracy provides Pepys with access to official reports and communications that ordinary citizens never see. Messages arrive throughout the day from various parish officials, ward constables, and civic authorities, each carrying fragments of information about the fire's progress and the authorities' increasingly desperate responses. Pepys systematically catalogs this intelligence, cross-referencing different accounts to build a comprehensive picture of events across the entire affected area. His training in naval administration, where inaccurate information can cost lives and battles, has made him skilled at evaluating the reliability of different sources and identifying the biases that might color their reports. The human drama unfolding in the streets provides Pepys with material that reveals his deep empathy for individual suffering, even as he maintains the analytical distance necessary for accurate reporting. He describes watching families evacuate their homes with whatever possessions they can carry, noting the heartbreaking decisions people make about what to save and what to abandon. A merchant struggles to choose between his account books, which represent years of careful business, and his wife's jewelry, which carries sentimental value far beyond its monetary worth. A widow attempts to save furniture that belonged to her deceased husband, only to realize that survival requires abandoning everything but the most essential items. These vignettes, recorded with the same attention to detail that Pepys brings to naval accounts, create a mosaic of human experience that transforms abstract disaster into intimate tragedy. Pepys's observations of the fire's behavior demonstrate his keen eye for technical details that will prove valuable for understanding both the immediate crisis and its long-term implications. He notes how different types of construction respond to the flames, observing that buildings with stone foundations and walls resist longer than their timber-framed neighbors, but that even the most substantial structures eventually succumb when their wooden interiors provide fuel for the increasingly intense heat. The lead pipes that carry water through the city melt in the extreme temperatures, eliminating any hope of fighting the fire with traditional methods. The iron window bars that were installed for security become red hot, turning windows into furnaces that spread the fire to building interiors even when the external walls remain intact. The social dynamics of the disaster fascinate Pepys as much as its physical characteristics, and his diary reflects his understanding of how extreme circumstances reveal both the best and worst of human nature. He observes acts of remarkable selflessness, recording how neighbors risk their own safety to help elderly or disabled residents escape from threatened buildings. He also notes instances of opportunism and greed, describing how some individuals attempt to profit from others at desperation by charging exorbitant fees for cart rental or boat passage. These contradictory responses to crisis provide him with insights into the complex nature of social solidarity, showing how disasters can simultaneously strengthen community bonds and create opportunities for exploitation. The destruction of London's commercial infrastructure captures Pepys' particular attention, given his role in naval administration and his understanding of the economic foundations of English power. The warehouses along the Thames that contain goods from across the known world represent not just private wealth, but the sinews of international trade that support England's growing influence as a maritime power. As these facilities burn, releasing exotic smells and spectacular displays of flame as different commodities ignite, Pepys calculates the broader implications for national prosperity and security. The destruction of naval stores, timber, iron, rope, canvas will directly affect his own work in England's ability to maintain the naval forces essential for national defense and commercial expansion. His Methodology for gathering information reflects the systematic approach that has made him successful in government service, rather than relying on single sources or casual observation. Pepys actively seeks out multiple perspectives on events, interviewing refugees from different neighborhoods, consulting with other officials, and personally visiting observation points that provide different vantages on the fire's progress. This triangulation of sources allows him to build a more accurate and comprehensive picture than would be possible through any single approach, and his diary reflects this multi-dimensional understanding of events as they unfold. The fire's impact on London's religious life provides Pepys with material for reflections that combine his personal Anglican faith with his broader understanding of social institutions and their role in maintaining community cohesion. As church after church succumbs to the flames, he documents not just the physical destruction, but the spiritual and social implications of losing these community centers. St. Lawrence Pountney, where he has attended services for years, burns with particular intensity, its ancient timbers providing spectacular fuel for flames that seem to mock the sacred purposes the building has served. The destruction of parish registers, which contain the only official records of births, marriages, and deaths for thousands of London families, represents a form of collective amnesia that will affect legal and inheritance matters for generations. Pepys's observations of the authorities' response to the crisis reveal his keen understanding of how government functions under extreme pressure. He notes the initial complacency of civic officials, who underestimate the fire's potential for destruction and delay implementing adequate countermeasures till the disaster has grown beyond the reach of conventional firefighting methods. The gradual involvement of higher authorities, including members of the royal family, demonstrates both the inadequacy of London's normal administrative structures for dealing with emergencies of this magnitude and the importance of decisive leadership in mobilizing effective responses to unprecedented challenges. The technical aspects of firefighting, or the lack thereof, provide Pepys with material for observations that will prove prescient for future urban planning and fire prevention. He documents the inadequacy of leather buckets and hand-pumped engines against a fire of this intensity, noting how the traditional methods that work for ordinary house fires prove laughably insufficient against a conflagration that has developed its own momentum and weather patterns. His observations about the need for wider streets, more substantial building construction, and better water supply systems anticipate many of the reforms that will be implemented during London's reconstruction. Psychological impact of witnessing such comprehensive destruction affects even an observer as disciplined and emotionally controlled as Pepys. In his diary reveals moments when the magnitude of the disaster threatens to overwhelm his professional detachment. He describes the strange sensation of watching familiar landmarks disappear, noting how the destruction of recognizable buildings creates a sense of geographical disorientation that compounds the emotional trauma of witnessing such massive loss. The Guildhall, where he has attended civic ceremonies and conducted official business, burns with particular intensity, its destruction representing not just the loss of a building, but the temporary collapse of the institutional structures that govern London life. His documentation of the fire's effect on different social classes reveals Pepys' acute awareness of how disasters affect people differently based on their economic circumstances and social connections. Wealthy merchants with country estates have options for temporary relocation that are unavailable to craftsmen and shopkeepers whose entire livelihood depends on their London businesses. The poor, who typically live in the most combustible housing and have the fewest resources for evacuation, face the greatest physical danger and the longest path to recovery. These observations reflect Pepys' understanding that while disasters may temporarily suspend normal social hierarchies, they ultimately tend to reinforce existing inequalities by affecting the vulnerable more severely than the privileged. The international implications of London's destruction occupy an increasingly important place in Pepys's thinking as the fire continues to spread. As a naval administrator, he understands how England's European rivals might view the disaster as an opportunity to advance their own interests, while England struggles to recover from such comprehensive urban destruction. The loss of London's commercial infrastructure will affect tax revenues that support military expenditures, while the destruction of naval stores will directly impact England's ability to maintain the fleet that serves as its primary defense against foreign invasion and its primary tool for protecting overseas trade routes. His personal experiences during the fire provide a counterpoint to his professional observations, revealing how even those in relatively secure positions must confront the practical and emotional challenges that disasters create. His arrangements for protecting his most valuable possessions, including his diary itself, demonstrate the difficulty of determining what is truly essential when normal life is disrupted by catastrophic events. His concerns about his wife, Elizabeth's safety and emotional well-being show how public officials must balance professional responsibilities with personal obligations during times of crisis. His efforts to maintain normal household routines while documenting extraordinary events reflect the human need for continuity and stability, even in the midst of unprecedented change. The cumulative effect of Pepys's systematic documentation creates a record that transcends simple disaster reporting to become a meditation on the nature of historical change and human resilience. His diary captures not just what happened during the Great Fire, but how it felt to live through such a comprehensive transformation of familiar surroundings and social structures. The combination of professional analysis and personal reflection, immediate observation and longer-term perspective, individual experience and collective tragedy, creates a multi-layered account that serves both as historical evidence and as literature, providing future generations with unprecedented insight into how ordinary people experience extraordinary events. His recognition that he is witnessing events of historical significance leads Pepys to take special care with his documentation, understanding that his diary may serve as an important source for future historians attempting to understand not just what happened during the Great Fire, but how it affected the people who lived through it. This historical consciousness adds a sense of purpose to his already meticulous record-keeping, transforming his personal diary into a public service that will preserve crucial information about one of the most important events in London's history for the benefit of posterity. By the morning of September 4th, Samuel Pepys confronts a reality that challenges even his considerable powers of observation and analysis. The fire has grown beyond the scope of ordinary disaster into something that seems to threaten the very existence of London as a functioning city. From his window on Seething Lane, he can see flames consuming areas that seemed safely distant just 24 hours earlier, and the wind that continues to drive the conflagration westward shows no signs of abating. His diary entry for this day begins with an acknowledgement that he is witnessing not merely a catastrophic fire, but the potential death of one of Europe's greatest cities. The methodical documentation that has characterized his approach throughout the crisis now takes on the urgency of a final testament, as if he understands that what he records may be among the last coherent accounts of London's medieval incarnation. The scope of destruction visible from his observation points defies his considerable vocabulary and challenges his ability to find adequate comparisons for what he witnesses. Entire neighborhoods that housed thousands of families have vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving only ash and the occasional blackened stone foundation to mark where centuries of human habitation once flourished. The familiar skyline that has oriented his movements through the city for decades has been transformed into an alien landscape of smoke, columns, and flame, punctuated by the skeletal remains of church towers and the glowing shells of substantial buildings whose stone walls contain furnaces where wooden interiors once provided comfort and shelter. His professional responsibilities as a naval administrator take on new dimensions as the fire approaches areas crucial to England's maritime infrastructure. The Navy office itself, his workplace and home, lies directly in the fire's projected path, and Pepys faces the prospect of losing not only his personal possessions, but the administrative records and institutional memory that support English naval operations. The irony is not lost on him that England's naval power, which depends on controlling the seas, may be crippled by a land-based disaster that destroys the bureaucratic machinery and physical infrastructure essential for maintaining the fleet. His diary reflects the strange experience of watching national security interests become secondary to immediate survival concerns. The human cost of the fire manifests in ways that test even Pepys's ability to maintain emotional equilibrium while recording events accurately. The refugee camps that have sprung up in fields outside the city limits house thousands of displaced Londoners, their temporary shelters creating new communities organized around shared loss rather than traditional social hierarchies. Children who have never spent a night away from their family homes now sleep under canvas or in the open air, their parents struggling to maintain some semblance of normal routine while confronting the reality that everything familiar has been destroyed. Elderly refugees, exhausted by evacuation and overwhelmed by the loss of possessions accumulated over lifetimes, simply sit among their meager salvaged belongings with expressions that speak of spirits broken as completely as their material. Circumstances, the destruction of St. Paul's Cathedral, provides Pepys with his most profound meditation on the fire's significance as both immediate disaster and historical watershed. The great church, which has dominated London's skyline for centuries and served as a symbol of both divine authority and royal power, stands increasingly isolated as the fire consumes the buildings around it. Pepys observes the cathedral's gradual transformation from a refuge where citizens sought divine protection from the flames to a victim, the very disaster from which they prayed for deliverance. When the roof finally catches fire, sending molten lead streaming down the ancient stones like metallic tears, he recognizes that he is witnessing the end of an era that stretches back to the Norman conquest and beyond. His documentation of the fire's impact on London's intellectual and cultural life reveals depths of loss that extend far beyond material destruction. The libraries and scriptoriums attached to various churches and institutions contain manuscripts and books that represent centuries of accumulated learning, much of it existing in single copies that will be impossible to replace. When the Guildhall's library burns, consuming legal records, historical chronicles, and administrative documents dating back centuries, Pepys understands that London is losing not just buildings, but memory itself. The destruction of these repositories of knowledge creates a form of cultural amnesia that will affect legal proceedings, property rights, and historical understanding for generations to come. The fire's creation of its own weather patterns fascinates Pepys from both scientific and practical perspectives, demonstrating his characteristic ability to find intellectual interest even in catastrophic events. He notes how the extreme heat generates wind currents that carry burning debris far beyond the fire's main body, creating new ignition points that defeat attempts to establish fire breaks or containment lines. The air above the burning city shimmers and dances with convection currents so powerful they affect cloud formation and precipitation patterns, turning the sky into a canvas painted in unnatural colors that range from copper to deep crimson. These observations reflect his understanding that the fire has grown beyond human scale to become a force of nature that follows its own logic, rather than responding to human efforts at control. The breakdown of normal commercial and social relationships provides Pepys with insights into how disasters reveal the underlying structures that support civilized life. The currency of everyday existence: reputation, credit, Social obligation becomes meaningless when survival depends on immediate physical resources and mutual aid. Merchants who built fortunes through careful cultivation of business relationships find themselves reduced to begging for cart space to evacuate their remaining goods. Craft guilds that have regulated trades for centuries cease to function as their halls burn and their members scatter too. Refugee camps where guild membership matters less than the ability to share food and provide physical labor for common survival. His observations of how different types of people respond to the crisis reveal Pepys's nuanced understanding of human psychology under extreme stress. Some refugees display remarkable resilience, immediately beginning to plan for rebuilding and recovery even before the fire has passed. Others seem paralyzed by the magnitude of their losses, sitting motionless among their salvaged possessions, as if waiting for some external authority to restore their familiar world. The contrast between those who adapt quickly to changed circumstances and those who cannot accept that their old life has ended permanently provides him with material for reflections on the nature of human adaptability and the psychological requirements for surviving catastrophic change. The fire's effect on London's religious communities offers Pepys opportunities to observe how shared faith responds to challenges that seem to exceed divine protection. Some clergy interpret the disaster as divine punishment for the city's sins, calling for repentance and spiritual renewal as prerequisites for both immediate deliverance and long-term recovery. Others focus on practical relief efforts, organizing food distribution and temporary shelter while postponing theological explanations for more appropriate times. The destruction of churches and the dispersal of congregations creates an unintended experiment in religious community, as believers must find new ways to maintain faith and fellowship without the institutional structures that have supported them for generations. His analysis of the authorities' evolving response to the crisis demonstrates his understanding of how governmental systems adapt to challenges that exceed their normal operational parameters. The initial confusion and inadequacy of civic responses gives way to more coordinated efforts as higher authorities recognize that conventional approaches are sufficient for a disaster of this magnitude. The involvement of the Duke of York and other members of the royal family in directing firefighting efforts represents not just practical necessity, but a recognition that the fire threatens interests that transcend local civic concerns and require national-level coordination and resources. The economic implications of the fire's destruction occupy an increasingly prominent place in Pepys's analysis as he begins to contemplate the challenges of recovery and rebuilding. The loss of so much commercial infrastructure will affect not just London, but the entire English economy, as the city serves as the hub for trade relationships that extend across Europe and into the growing overseas empire. The destruction of warehouses, shops, and workshops eliminates employment for thousands of workers, while simultaneously destroying the physical capital that makes their work productive. The complexity of these economic relationships means that the fire's effects will ripple outward for years, affecting communities far from London that depend on the city's commercial networks for their own prosperity. His personal preparations for possible evacuation revealed the difficulty of determining what is truly essential when normal life is disrupted by events of unprecedented scope and intensity. The process of selecting which possessions to save forces difficult decisions about what defines identity and continuity when everything familiar is threatened with destruction. His diary itself becomes a crucial consideration. The record he has maintained for years represents not just personal memory but historical evidence that may prove invaluable for understanding the fire and its consequences. The irony that preserving his documentation of the disaster requires risking his own safety to remain close to events illustrates the tension between historical duty and personal survival that characterizes his situation throughout the crisis. The fire's approach toward areas that house national institutions and royal properties adds political dimensions to Pepys's observations that extend beyond his immediate administrative concerns. The potential destruction of Whitehall Palace and other symbols of royal authority would represent not just material loss, but a challenge to the stability of the political system that emerged from the restoration of 1660. Foreign observers and domestic critics might interpret such comprehensive destruction of governmental infrastructure as evidence of divine displeasure with the current regime, or as an opportunity to advance competing claims to authority and legitimacy. His recognition that he is witnessing a historical watershed leads Pepys to take special care with his final observations of medieval London before its transformation through rebuilding. He documents architectural details and urban arrangements that may never be reconstructed, understanding that his diary may serve as one of the few reliable sources for understanding how the medieval city looked and functioned before the fire swept it away. These descriptions take on the quality of an elegy for a vanished world, capturing not just physical details, but the atmosphere and character of urban life that had evolved over centuries and was disappearing in a matter of days. The cumulative psychological impact of witnessing such comprehensive destruction begins to affect even Pepys's remarkable emotional resilience, and his diary entries reveal moments when the magnitude of the disaster threatens to overwhelm his professional detachment. The strange experience of watching a familiar world disappear creates a form of existential vertigo that challenges basic assumptions about permanence and security. The realization that institutions and structures that seemed eternal can vanish in hours forces a reconsideration of what can be trusted to endure and what must be accepted as temporary and vulnerable to forces beyond human control. His final entries about the fire's active phase combine immediate observation with longer-term reflection as he begins to process the full implications of what he has witnessed and documented. The fire that began as a local emergency has become a transformative event that will reshape not just London's physical appearance, but its social structures, economic relationships, and cultural identity. His diary preserves not just the facts of what happened, but the experience of living through such comprehensive change, creating a record that serves both as historical evidence and as testimony to human resilience in the face of catastrophic loss. In the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral, as the Great Fire approaches its ancient walls on September 4th, 1666, lies a collection of treasures that represents over 1,000 years of accumulated faith, learning, and artistic achievement. The great church, begun by the Normans and expanded through centuries of royal patronage and popular devotion, houses not merely religious artifacts, but the very soul of English Christian civilization. Within its massive stone walls rest manuscripts illuminated by monks whose names have been forgotten by history. Silver vessels crafted by artisans whose skills died with them. Stained glass windows that transform sunlight into prayers of colored light. And wooden carvings that speak of a time when faith and artistry were indistinguishable. As the flames draw inexorably closer, these treasures face an end as final and complete as the destruction of Alexander's library, their loss representing not just material devastation, but the severing of connections to a past that will never again be so tangible or immediate. The cathedral's library, housed in chambers above the choir, contains one of England's most significant collections of medieval manuscripts and early printed books. Here rest the chronicles that record the deeds of kings and the struggles of common people, written in careful Latin script by generations of clerical scholars who understood themselves as guardians of memory in an age when few could read and fewer still could write. The Venerable Bede's ecclesiastical history exists here in a manuscript copied just 3 centuries after his death. Its vellum pages bearing marginal notes in the hands of readers who studied it when the Norman conquest was still within living memory. Chaucer's works rest beside theological treatises and historical chronicles, creating a library that encompasses both the sacred and secular. Learning of medieval England. Among the most precious items threatened by the approaching flames are the illuminated psalters and books of hours that represent the pinnacle of medieval artistic achievement. These manuscripts, graded over months or years by monks and secular scribes working in scriptoriums across England and Europe, combine devotional texts with artistic decoration that transforms the written word into visual prayer. The gold leaf that adorns their initial letters catches candlelight like captured stars, while the intricate border decorations reveal a world where every flower, bird, and geometric pattern carries theological significance. The pigments used in their creational ultramarine derived from lapis lazuli, vermilion from crushed cinnabar, gold from beaten metal, represent trade relationships that stretched across continents and economic investments that might bankrupt lesser institutions. The cathedral's collection of reliquaries contains physical remnants of saints and martyrs that connect the English church to the broader story of Christian faith. These vessels, crafted from precious metals and adorned with gems, house fragments of bone, pieces of clothing, and other material traces of holy lives that serve as focal points for prayer and pilgrimage. The reliquary of St. Erkenwald, London's patron saint, contains portions of the bishop who served the city in the 7th century, his remains becoming the foundation for a cult that drew pilgrims from across England and Europe. The destruction of these relics will sever not just spiritual connections, but economic ones, as the pilgrimage trade that they generated provided substantial income for the cathedral and the surrounding businesses that catered to religious travelers. The stained glass windows of St. Paul's represent a form of artistic expression that will prove impossible to recreate once lost. Their techniques and artistic vision reflecting a medieval worldview that Renaissance and Reformation thinking has already begun to displace. The great rose window above the west entrance transforms the setting sun into a kaleidoscope of sacred imagery. Its hundreds of individual glass pieces assembled into patterns that tell the story of salvation through color and light. The clear story windows that line the nave create a continuous narrative in glass, depicting scenes from Scripture and the lives of saints in a visual language that could communicate complex theological concepts to illiterate worshippers. The loss of these windows will eliminate not just artistic masterpieces, but an entire vocabulary of visual theology that took centuries to develop and refine. The cathedral's musical traditions face equally complete obliteration as the fire approaches. The choir stalls and organ chambers, where centuries of worship have created one of England's most sophisticated musical establishments. The massive pipe organ, its thousands of bronze and lead pipes voiced to fill the enormous space of the cathedral, represents not just a musical instrument, but a technology that required generations of craftsmen to perfect. The choir stalls, carved from oak and decorated with elaborate misericords that display everything from biblical scenes to satirical commentary on contemporary life, provide physical evidence of the intersection between sacred and secular culture that characterized medieval religious life among the cathedrals. Treasures that face destruction are the memorial brasses and stone effigies that transform the building into a three-dimensional history book, recording the lives and achievements of London's most prominent citizens. These monuments, commissioned by wealthy merchants, noble families, and church dignitaries, represent not just artistic achievement, but social documentation that reveals different generations understood the relationship between earthly success and eternal salvation. The brass of Dean Collett, the Renaissance humanist who founded St. Paul's School, lies near monuments to medieval bishops whose Latin inscriptions chronicle theological controversies that once divided Christendom. The loss of these memorials will eliminate irreplaceable evidence of how English society evolved from medieval feudalism through Renaissance humanism to Reformation Protestantism. The cathedral's plate and liturgical vessels represent centuries of accumulated wealth dedicated to the glorification of divine worship. They are precious metals and elaborate craftsmanship, reflecting both the economic prosperity of London's religious institutions and the artistic skills of generations of metalworkers. The great silver chalices used for communion services carry inscriptions that record the names of donors whose families rose and fell with the fortunes of London trade. The elaborate reliquaries, monstrances, and processional crosses that once defined the rhythm of Catholic worship now serve more modest Protestant liturgies. Their rich decoration a reminder of the religious controversies that transformed English spiritual life. The melting of these vessels in the fire's heat will eliminate not just valuable objects, but physical evidence of the economic and artistic relationships that sustained medieval religious culture. The loss of the cathedral's archives represents a particularly devastating blow to English legal and administrative history, as these documents record property transactions, legal disputes, and administrative decisions that affect thousands of families and institutions across London and beyond. The marriage records, baptismal registers, burial documents maintained by the cathedral parish provide the only official documentation of vital events for much of London's population. Property deeds and wills registered with church authorities establish legal claims that affect inheritance, rights, and commercial relationships throughout the city. The destruction of these archives will create legal chaos that will require decades to resolve and will permanently obscure the historical record of London's social and economic development. The Cathedral School, founded by Dean Collett in the early 16th century as a monument to Renaissance educational ideals, houses a library and educational resources that represent the intersection of religious tradition and humanistic learning. The school's collection includes not just theological works, but classical texts, mathematical treatises, and geographical works that reflect the expanding intellectual horizons of Renaissance England. The loss of these educational resources will affect not just current students, but future generations who might have benefited from access to rare texts and educational traditions that took centuries to develop. The destruction of the school represents the severing of intellectual continuity that connects medieval scholasticism to Renaissance humanism and early modern scientific thinking. The fire's approach forces recognition that the cathedral represents not just a building or even a collection of valuable objects, but a living institution that has evolved through centuries of change while maintaining continuity with England's Christian past. The daily rhythm of prayer, the cycle of seasonal celebrations, the educational activities, and the charitable works that define the cathedral's mission depend not just on physical structures, but on institutional memory and traditional practices that may not survive the disruption of complete destruction. The loss of St. Paul's threatens to break chains of religious and cultural transmission that stretch back to the conversion of Anglo-Saxon England and forward to future generations who will inherit a Christianity shaped by this catastrophic interruption. The broader implications of losing such a concentration of cultural treasures extend beyond London to affect England's position in European intellectual and artistic life, as the cathedral's collections represent England's participation in international networks of religious and scholarly exchange that have developed over centuries. The manuscripts, artworks, and liturgical objects threatened by the fire connect English Christianity to broader European traditions, while also documenting distinctively English contributions to medieval and early modern culture. Their destruction will impoverish not just English cultural heritage, but the broader European legacy of Christian civilization that depends on the preservation of diverse regional expressions of shared religious and intellectual traditions. As the flames finally reach the cathedral precincts, The loss of these irreplaceable treasures becomes not just a material fact, but spiritual and cultural catastrophe that will affect English, religious, and intellectual life for generations. The melting of silver vessels, the burning of priceless manuscripts, the shattering of stained glass masterpieces, and the collapse of stone monuments represent the kind of comprehensive cultural destruction that normally requires warfare or deliberate vandalism to achieve. The random nature of this loss, caused by accident rather than intention, makes it perhaps more tragic than deliberate destruction, as it eliminates treasures that no human agency sought to destroy and that no human effort can recreate once they are gone. Beneath the spectacular destruction visible from the Thames and the refugee camps, the Great Fire consumes layers of London's hidden history that will remain buried for centuries after the flames subside. In cellars, in crypts, in forgotten chambers, and sealed vaults, in the foundations of buildings whose origins stretch back to Roman times, lies evidence of London's complex past that exists nowhere else in written records or surviving monuments. As the fire burns downward through timber floors and stone foundations, as molten lead from roofs pours into underground spaces, as superheated air transforms cellars into furnaces, these archaeological treasures face destruction that will leave gaps in human knowledge that can never be filled. The loss extends beyond visible monuments to encompass the buried remnants of daily life, religious practice, and commercial activity that accumulated over 15 centuries of continuous habitation. The Roman foundations that underlie much of medieval London carry within their mortared stones and buried chambers the physical evidence of Britain's first urban civilization, artifacts and architectural features that document the transformation of Celtic settlement into imperial city. In the cellars of buildings near the old Roman Forum, pottery fragments and coin hoards rest undisturbed since the legions departed, their brass and silver surfaces oxidized by centuries of burial, but still capable of revealing details about trade relationships, artistic styles, and economic systems that connected Roman Londinium to the broader Mediterranean world. The fire's heat, penetrating deep into the earth through collapsed buildings and molten materials, reaches temperatures sufficient to alter the chemical composition of these artifacts, destroying the patina and metallurgical evidence that might otherwise survive for archaeologists to study centuries in the future. The Saxon and Norman churches that were demolished or incorporated into later buildings left behind foundation stones, burial chambers, and ceremonial objects that provide unique insights into the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England and the Norman transformation of English religious life. Beneath the chancel of St. Bride's Church rest the stones of a Saxon predecessor whose architectural details reflect the fusion of Germanic building traditions with Roman engineering techniques that characterized early medieval construction. The burial chambers contain not just human remains, but grave goods that reveal the persistence of pagan traditions within Christian communities. Silver brooches and bronze buckles decorated with animal motifs that connect Christian Anglo-Saxons to their pre-conversion ancestors. As the fire consumes the wooden superstructure of the medieval church and sends molten lead cascading into these underground spaces, it destroys evidence of religious and cultural continuity that took generations of careful scholarship to accumulate and interpret. The medieval guild halls and merchant houses that crowd London's commercial districts conceal beneath their floors the accumulated debris of centuries of trade and craftsmanship, physical evidence of economic relationships and technological development that exists nowhere in written records. The basement workshops where goldsmiths melted precious metals contain crucibles, molds, and metal fragments that document the evolution of artistic styles and technical procedures from Byzantine influences through Gothic innovations to Renaissance naturalism. The fire's intense heat transforms these archaeological deposits into unrecognizable slag, eliminating evidence of workshop practices trade connections, and artistic influences that connected London craftsmen to European networks of commercial and cultural exchange. The Jewish quarter, which flourished before the expulsion of 1290, left behind physical traces of religious and domestic life that provide rare insights into medieval Jewish communities in Christian Europe. Hidden beneath later Christian buildings, ritual baths and Torah storage chambers contain fragments of Hebrew manuscripts, ceremonial objects, and architectural features that document religious practices and community organization during the period when England's Jewish population contributed significantly to the kingdom's commercial and intellectual development. The fire's destruction of these hidden spaces eliminates irreplaceable evidence of Jewish life in medieval England, destroying physical remnants of communities whose written records were largely lost or destroyed during the persecution that led to their expulsion in the cellars of taverns and private houses throughout the Old City. Wine cellars and storage chambers contain amphory bottles and ceramic vessels that tell the story of London's participation in international trade networks stretching from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. The shapes, glazes, and decorative motifs of these containers reveal commercial relationships with Flemish cloth merchants, French wine producers, German metalworkers, and Italian silk traders, documenting the economic connections that made London one of Europe's most important commercial centers. As the fire's heat cracks these vessels and melts their glazed surfaces, it destroys evidence of trade patterns, artistic influences, and economic relationships that took centuries to develop, and dead, written records document only imperfectly the plague pits and mass burial grounds that lie beneath London streets contain human remains and associated artifacts that provide crucial evidence about disease, mortality, and social responses to epidemic crisis throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The Black Death of 1348 to 1349 left behind burial sites whose location and contents revealed how London's population dealt with catastrophic mortality, while later plague outbreaks created additional burial grounds that document the persistence of epidemic disease in urban environments. The fire's extreme heat affects not just surface buildings, but underground spaces where human remains and associated artifacts preserve evidence of medieval medicine, funeral practices, and social organization during times of crisis. The Roman amphitheater, whose existence is known from historical references, but whose exact location and architectural details remain mysterious, lies buried beneath later construction somewhere in the area now being consumed by flames. Archaeological evidence of this massive structure will provide invaluable insights into Roman entertainment culture, engineering techniques, and urban planning, while its relationship to surrounding buildings might reveal how medieval Londoners understood and used the architectural legacy of their Roman predecessors. The fire's destruction of buildings and the resulting changes to ground, level, and foundation structures may eliminate forever the possibility of locating and excavating this monument to Roman London's importance as a provincial capital. Beneath the houses of London's merchant elite, strong rooms and treasure chambers contain not just hoards of coins and precious objects, but the physical clues and infrastructure of medieval and early modern banking, including scales, weights, account books, and security devices that document the evolution of commercial practices from barter-based local exchange to the sophisticated international finance that supports England's growing overseas trade. The fire's penetration into these secure spaces destroys evidence of financial innovation, commercial law, and international economic relationships that made London a center of European commerce during the crucial centuries, when trade patterns shifted from Mediterranean to Atlantic focus as the fire consumes layer after layer of London's accumulated history. It creates an archaeological catastrophe whose implications will not be fully understood for centuries. The destruction extends beyond visible monuments to encompass the physical evidence of daily life, commercial activity and cultural development that accumulated in countless small deposits throughout the city's long history. This buried evidence, which might otherwise provide future scholars with detailed insights into medieval and early modern urban life, vanishes in temperatures that transform organic materials into ash, melt metals into unrecognizable forms, and crack stone and ceramic artifacts beyond recovery or interpretation. The random nature of this archaeological destruction makes it particularly tragic, as it eliminates evidence that no human agency sought to destroy, and that represents the accumulated material culture of generations of Londoners who lived, worked, and died without knowing that their possessions and remains would become historical documents. The fire creates gaps in the archaeological record that will frustrate future historians and archaeologists attempting to understand London's development, leaving questions about medieval urban life, commercial practices, and cultural relationships that can never be answered with the precision that physical evidence might otherwise provide. In the deepest recesses beneath London's burning streets, where stone foundations meet, London clay, and where the accumulated detritus of 15 centuries lies compressed into archaeological strata, the Great Fire's destruction reaches beyond the merely catastrophic into the realm of the irreplaceable. Here, beneath the visible drama of collapsing timber and melting lead, lies evidence so fragile and irreplaceable that its loss will leave permanent gaps in humanity's understanding of its own past. The Roman tessellated floors that once graced villa courtyards, now buried beneath layers of Saxon refuse and Norman construction debris, crack and fragment under thermal shock as temperatures above ground reach levels that penetrate deep into the Earth's protective layers. These geometric patterns in stone and ceramic, which survived barbarian invasions and medieval rebuilding, succumb finally to an enemy that recognizes no distinction between the precious and the mundane, reducing 1,000 years of careful preservation to rubble that will puzzle archaeologists for centuries to come. The Saxon wooden churches, whose post holes and foundation trenches provide the only evidence of the earliest Christian architecture in Anglo-Saxon London, face obliteration as the fire's heat penetrates soil layers that have protected their ghostly outlines for 8 centuries. These phantom buildings, visible only as discolorations in the earth and patterns of compressed soil where timber once stood, represent the earliest phase of London's Christian history, when Celtic and Roman traditions merged with Germanic building practices to create distinctively English forms of religious architecture. The archaeological signatures of these vanished churches, the distribution of nails and metal fittings, Atenes, the patterns of stone footings, the layers of mortar and ash that mark construction and destruction, required the most delicate excavation techniques to interpret, and their loss to fire damage will eliminate forever the possibility of understanding how Christianity established itself physically in post-Roman London. Deep within the ruins of Roman London, beneath cellars and foundations that themselves date to Norman times, lie the hypocaust systems and bath complexes that once provided heated floors and warm water to the villa suburbs of Londinium. These sophisticated engineering systems, with their carefully constructed flues and radiant heating chambers, represent the pinnacle of Roman domestic technology and provide irreplaceable evidence of daily life among the provincial elite who governed Britain for 4 centuries. The fire's penetration into these underground spaces introduces temperatures that exceed even the heat for which they were designed, causing thermal expansion that cracks masonry joints, spalls stone surfaces, and destroys the delicate engineering relationships that made these systems functional. The loss of these intact heating systems eliminates the opportunity for future researchers to understand Roman domestic technology through direct examination, rather than literary description. The medieval hospitals and charitable institutions that served London's poor left behind distinctive architectural features and artifact assemblages that document the development of organized medical care and social welfare from monastic charity through secular poor relief. St. Bartholomew's Hospital, whose Norman foundations rest beneath later rebuilding, contains stone-carved apothecary measures, surgical instruments, and medicinal preparation equipment that provide physical evidence of medieval medical practice. The hospital's burial ground, where the poor and indigent found their final rest, contains human remains that preserve evidence of medieval disease patterns, dietary deficiencies, and medical treatments that existed nowhere else in such a concentrated form. As the fire consumes the buildings above and sends molten materials cascading into these burial areas, it destroys irreplaceable evidence of medieval medicine and social care that could illuminate the lives of London's most vulnerable populations. The Jewish ritual bath discovered in recent decades beneath Milk Street represents only the visible portion of a much larger complex of religious and domestic buildings that served London's medieval Jewish community before the expulsion of 1,290. Buried beneath this ritual bath lie foundation stones, drainage systems, and artifact deposits that could provide unprecedented insights into Jewish domestic life, religious practice, and community organization in medieval England. The fire's destruction of buildings above this archaeological site introduces structural stability and contamination that will compromise any future excavation, while the extreme heat may alter the chemical composition of organic materials and metal artifacts that have survived for nearly 4 centuries in London's protective soil. The plague pits that mark London's periodic encounters with epidemic disease contain not just human remains, but the material culture of crisis, the hastily buried possessions of plague victims, the crude coffins and burial shrouds that mark desperate attempts to maintain dignity in the face of mass mortality, the coins and religious medals that reflect both hope for divine intervention and preparation for death. These burial sites, often unmarked and forgotten, provide crucial evidence about medieval and early modern responses to epidemic disease, social organization during crisis, and the intersection of religious belief with medical understanding. The fire's effects on these burial grounds, including soil disturbance from collapsed buildings and chemical contamination from burning materials, will destroy the archaeological context that makes such evidence scientifically valuable. The workshops of London's immigrant communities preserve evidence of technological transfer and cultural exchange that shaped English craft traditions for centuries. The Flemish weavers who settled in London during the 14th century brought with them distinctive tools, techniques, and workshop organization that can be traced through archaeological evidence, even when written records are silent. Their looms, dye vats, and finishing equipment, often buried beneath later construction, document the process by which foreign innovations became integral to English textile production. The German metalworkers who established themselves near the Tower of London left behind forges, molds, and metallurgical equipment that revealed the technological exchanges that enhanced English armaments and decorative arts. As the fire destroys buildings that conceal these workshop sites, it eliminates evidence of cultural and technological transmission that made London a center of international craftsmanship. The Roman drainage systems and water supply infrastructure that continued to function throughout the medieval period provide evidence of engineering continuity and technological adaptation that survived the collapse of Roman administration. These underground networks, including lead pipes, stone channels, and ceramic distribution systems, document how medieval Londoners maintained and modified Roman engineering to meet changing urban needs. The fire's destruction of buildings that concealed access points to these systems, combined with the melting of lead components and structural damage from collapsed foundations, will compromise future research into the technological relationships between Roman and medieval London, the private oratories and hidden chapels that served London's Catholic population during periods of Protestant persecution contained altarpieces, religious sculptures, and devotional objects that were concealed rather than destroyed during religious reforms. These secret religious spaces, often located in cellars or concealed chambers within larger buildings. Preserve evidence of religious continuity and resistance that challenges simple narratives of religious change. The carved stone altars, wooden rood screens, and painted religious images that survived official destruction through private devotion now face obliteration by an enemy that makes no distinction between officially sanctioned and secretly preserved religious art. The foundry areas and metalworking, sites that supplied London with everything from church bells to cooking pots, contain furnaces, molds, and raw materials that document the technological processes that supported medieval and early modern urban life. These industrial sites, often located near water sources for cooling and cleaning, preserve evidence of metallurgical techniques, fuel sources, and production methods that written records describe only superficially. The fire's destruction of these sites eliminates the opportunity for future researchers to understand pre-industrial technology through direct examination of intact workshop complexes. As the fire penetrates deeper into London's archaeological layers, it creates a disaster that extends far beyond the immediate crisis to affect humanity's understanding of its own past. The destruction of these buried treasures eliminates evidence that took centuries to accumulate and that can never be replaced through any amount of scholarly effort or financial investment. The random nature of this archaeological catastrophe makes it particularly tragic, as it destroys evidence that no human agency sought to eliminate, and that represents the accumulated material culture of countless generations who lived and died without knowing that their possessions and remains would become historical documents. The gaps in the archaeological record created by the Great Fire will frustrate researchers for centuries to come, leaving questions about medieval urban life, Roman provincial administration, and cultural continuity that can never be answered with the precision that physical evidence might otherwise provide. In the temporary structures and hastily converted buildings that will soon become the coffee houses of the new London, a different kind of civilization begins to emerge from the ashes of the Great Fire. Here, in spaces that still smell of sawdust and fresh mortar, where the morning light filters through windows not yet properly glazed, the ritual of coffee drinking creates new forms of social interaction that will reshape English, commercial, and intellectual life for centuries to come. The bitter, aromatic brew that steams in delicate porcelain cups represents more than mere refreshment. It embodies the transformation of London from a medieval city of guilds and parishes into a modern metropolis of commerce and information, where news travels faster than royal messengers, and where fortunes can be made or lost on the strength of a rumor, shared over morning coffee around the polished mahogany tables that reflect the flames of carefully tended coal fires. Conversations unfold that reveal the complex mathematics of international commerce, where profit margins depend on accurate intelligence about everything from harvest conditions in distant colonies to political stability in European capitals. Thomas Papillon, the Huguenot merchant whose family fled religious persecution in France, discusses with his coffee companions the implications of Louis's latest territorial ambitions for the security of trade routes through the Spanish Netherlands. His analysis, informed by correspondence with Protestant merchants across Europe, reveals how religious and commercial interests intertwine in ways that make commercial intelligence inseparable from diplomatic intelligence, and how the price of coffee itself reflects the complex relationships between European powers competing for control of global trade routes. The physical environment of these emerging commercial spaces reflects both the necessities imposed by recent destruction and the aspirations of men who see opportunity in catastrophe. The furniture, much of it crafted hastily by joiners working around the clock to meet demand from newly wealthy clients, displays a utilitarian elegance that will characterize English commercial architecture for generations. The chairs, built for comfort during long business discussions, feature leather upholstery that bears the scents of the tanning yards, while the tables, constructed from oak salvaged from demolished buildings, carry the patina of age that connects the new commercial order to England's timber, forests, and maritime traditions. The coffee service itself, imported from China and the Ottoman Empire, represents the global reach of English commerce and the cosmopolitan tastes of merchants whose business interests span continents. The morning newspapers that circulate through these commercial gatherings transform coffee drinking from private consumption into public ritual. As merchants share and interpret information that arrives from across Europe and the expanding English Empire, the London Gazette, its pages still damp from the printing house, carries official announcements about trade regulations and diplomatic developments, while privately circulated newsletters provide the kind of detailed commercial intelligence that can mean the difference between profit and bankruptcy. The reading of these publications becomes a collective activity, with experienced merchants providing commentary and interpretation that reveals how seemingly distant events might affect local business conditions and investment opportunities. The social rituals that develop around coffee consumption create new forms of hierarchy and inclusion that challenge traditional distinctions based on birth and inherited status, replacing them with networks organized around commercial competence and financial resources. The seating arrangements that emerge naturally in these spaces reflect not noble rank, but commercial reputation, with the most successful merchants occupying positions that allow them to monitor all conversations, while controlling access to the most valuable information. Younger merchants and aspiring traders position themselves where they can overhear discussions between established figures, understanding that a single insight or contact acquired during morning coffee might provide the foundation for future prosperity. The international character of London's merchant community becomes particularly visible in these coffeehouse gatherings, where Dutch financiers, German traders, Italian bankers conduct business in a mixture of languages that reflects the cosmopolitan nature of 17th century commerce. Peter van der Meer, whose family's banking connections extend from Amsterdam to Venice, negotiates exchange rates and credit arrangements that will facilitate trade transactions across multiple currencies and jurisdictions. His conversations, conducted in a mixture of English, Dutch, and commercial Latin, reveal how international commerce depends on personal relationships and reputation that transcend national boundaries, and how London's position as a commercial center depends on its ability to attract and retain foreign expertise and capital. The coffee itself, that exotic substance whose cultivation and preparation remain mysterious to most Londoners, carries symbolic significance that extends far beyond its chemical properties as a stimulant. The beans, roasted according to methods learned from Levantine traders, release aromas that evoke the spice markets of Constantinople and the coffee houses of Vienna, connecting London's emergent commercial culture to urban traditions that developed around the Mediterranean and in the Ottoman Empire. The preparation ritual, involving grinding, boiling, and careful attention to timing and temperature, becomes a form of theater that demonstrates both sophistication and control over exotic materials and techniques. The political dimensions of coffeehouse culture emerge subtly through conversations that reveal how commercial interests shape and are shaped by government policy, foreign relations, and domestic political developments. Sir William Petty, whose statistical analyses of population and trade have made him influential in government circles, discusses with his coffee companions the implications of the recent Navigation Acts for English shipping and colonial trade. His observations, informed by both commercial experience and access to government data, reveal how policy decisions made in Whitehall affect the daily business operations of merchants who may never see the inside of a government office, but whose prosperity depends on favorable regulatory environments and diplomatic relationships. The emergence of specialized coffee houses that catered to particular trades and professions creates new forms of institutional organization that will reshape London's commercial infrastructure for centuries to come. At Lloyd's, marine insurance brokers gather to assess risks and set premiums for voyages to distant ports. Their calculations, based on information about weather patterns, political conditions, and shipping routes that they share over coffee that fuels discussions lasting from dawn to dusk. At Jonathan's, stock traders develop the informal networks and information sharing practices that will eventually evolve into organized securities markets. Their morning coffee providing the social lubrication necessary for the trust relationships that make financial markets possible. The daily rhythm of coffeehouse life creates new temporal structures that organize commercial activity around the arrival of ships, the opening of markets, and the circulation of information that travels according to schedules determined by wind patterns and postal routes, rather than traditional religious or agricultural calendars. The morning gathering that begins with the first light continues until the last ships have ported their arrivals and departures, creating an extended period of commercial activity that reflects London's growing importance as a center of international trade and finance. This new organization of time around commercial rather than agricultural or religious priorities represents a fundamental shift in urban culture that will characterize English commercial development for centuries to come. Beyond the public theater of the coffee houses, in the private chambers and exclusive clubs that are already forming among London's most successful merchants, a different kind of commerce unfolds that will determine not just individual fortunes, but the direction of England's economic and imperial development for generations to come. Here, in wood-paneled rooms where Persian carpets muffle footsteps and where Connie's porcelain reflects the light of silver candelabra, the true masters of London's emerging commercial empire conduct business that involves sums so vast and enterprises so complex that they require the kind of secrecy and discretion impossible in the public coffee houses. These private gatherings, often disguised as social visits or charitable meetings, bring together men whose combined wealth exceeds that of many European principalities, and whose decisions about investment and trade will shape the global economy in ways that no individual monarch or government can match. Sir Josiah Childs' private study in his mansion near Lincoln's Inn Fields serves as an unofficial headquarters for the East India Company's most sensitive operations, where directors meet to discuss strategies that involve not just commercial competition, but diplomatic intrigue, military action, and political manipulation on a scale that transforms merchants into de facto rulers of distant territories. The maps that cover the walls of his study, hand-drawn by company surveyors and marked with notations about monsoon patterns, political alliances, and resource locations, represent intelligence gathered at enormous cost in both money and human lives. The discussions that unfold around his mahogany conference table involve decisions about which Indian princes to support with loans to military advisors, which European rivals to undermine through price competition and diplomatic pressure, and which new territories to penetrate through the careful combination of trade agreements and military threats. The financial instruments that these merchant princes deploy in their private dealings represent innovations in credit, insurance, and investment that will revolutionize international commerce and create the foundation for England's eventual dominance of global trade. Thomas Papillon's Huguenot banking connections allow him to offer credit arrangements that span multiple currencies and jurisdictions, enabling English merchants to finance operations in markets from the Baltic to the Indian Ocean without the limitations imposed by traditional banking systems tied to specific territories or rulers. His private agreements with Dutch financiers and German banking houses create informal international financial networks that move capital more efficiently than any government system, while his careful attention to exchange rates and political stability allows him to profit from the very uncertainties that destroy less sophisticated merchants. The technological secrets that these elite merchants guard so carefully in their private meetings involve not just commercial intelligence, but industrial processes and navigational techniques that provide competitive advantages worth more than armies or fleets. Sir William Pepys' innovations in shipbuilding and navigation, developed through careful observation and mathematical analysis, enable English vessels to carry larger cargoes more safely and efficiently than their European competitors. His private workshops, hidden in the cellars beneath his Piccadilly mansion, employ craftsmen sworn to secrecy who develop new techniques for cannon boring, compass adjustment, and hull design that will give English ships decisive advantages in both commercial and military operations. The political dimensions of elite merchant activity reveal how commercial interests shape government policy through personal relationships and financial influence that operate far from public view or parliamentary oversight. The Duke of York's personal investments in slave trading ventures, managed discreetly through nominee arrangements with trusted merchants, create conflicts of interest that affect royal policy toward colonial development and international relations. The private loans that wealthy merchants provide to chronically cash-strapped government departments purchase influence over regulatory decisions, customs policies, and diplomatic appointments that can be worth millions in increased profits or avoided losses. The intelligence networks that support these private commercial operations rival those of any European government in their scope and sophistication, employing agents who gather information about everything from harvest conditions in distant colonies to the personal weaknesses of foreign officials who might be bribed or coerced into favorable arrangements. Captain John Smith, whose official position with the Royal Navy provides cover for commercial espionage, maintains correspondence with ship captains, port officials, and colonial administrators across the English Empire who provide detailed reports about local conditions, political developments, and commercial opportunities. This intelligence, analyzed and interpreted in the private meetings of London's merchant elite, enables them to anticipate market movements and political changes with an accuracy that seems almost supernatural to their less well-informed competitors. The luxury goods that fill the private residences of these merchant princes represent not just personal consumption, but sophisticated understanding of international markets, cultural preferences, and technological capabilities that inform their commercial strategies. The Chinese porcelain that decorates their dining rooms reflects detailed knowledge of Asian manufacturing techniques and trade routes, while the Turkish carpets that cover their floors demonstrate understanding of Central Asian political conditions and transportation networks. These objects serve as both status symbols and commercial intelligence, as their quality, style, and availability provide insights into distant markets and production capabilities that can inform future investment decisions. The private libraries, maintained by the most sophisticated merchants, contain not just account books and commercial correspondence, but scientific treatises, geographical surveys, and technological manuals that provide the knowledge base necessary for large-scale commercial operations in an era when information travels slowly and inaccurately. Sir William Pepys' collection of mathematical and navigational texts, combined with his correspondence with scholars across Europe, enables him to make calculations about voyage planning, cargo capacity, and risk assessment that give his ventures decisive advantages over competitors who rely on traditional methods and conventional wisdom. The urban planning initiatives that wealthy merchants begin to support in the wake of the Great Fire reflect both self-interest and broader vision about London's future development as a commercial center. The wider streets and more substantial buildings that they advocate will facilitate the movement of goods and people while reducing fire risk, but they will also create opportunities for profitable real estate development and speculation. The new markets and commercial facilities that they propose will serve their own business needs while also demonstrating their commitment to London's prosperity in their qualification for political influence and social recognition. As these private networks of wealth and influence consolidate in the years following the Great Fire, they create new forms of power that will challenge traditional aristocratic dominance while also supporting England's emergence as a global commercial and imperial power. The decisions made in these exclusive gatherings, invisible to most Londoners but affecting millions of people across the expanding English empire, represent the emergence of a new form of governance based on economic rather than military or religious authority, and the creation of institutions that will shape global development for centuries to come. In the spacious mansions rising from the ashes of medieval London, a new aristocracy of commerce creates domestic environments that both display their unprecedented wealth and facilitate the complex social and business relationships essential to their continued prosperity. These palatial residences, designed by architects who have studied the latest continental styles while adapting them to English climate and commercial requirements, represent far more than mere domestic comfort. They embody a new understanding of how private space can serve public purposes, how domestic architecture can express commercial power, and how the careful design of social environments can facilitate the relationships and conversations that determine the direction of international trade and imperial expansion. The merchant princes who commissioned these architectural monuments understand that in an age of expanding global commerce, the home becomes an extension of the counting house, and domestic hospitality becomes a tool of commercial and political influence as important as ships, armies, or diplomatic missions. Sir Josiah Child's mansion, rising 4 stories above Lincoln's Inn Fields with a facade that rivals those of noble palaces, demonstrates how commercial wealth translates into architectural statements that challenge traditional hierarchies, while creating new ones based on economic achievement rather than inherited status. The Portland stone facade, its creamy surface dressed with classical pilasters and elaborate window surrounds, makes subtle reference to Italian Renaissance palaces while asserting distinctively English characteristics that reflect both national pride and commercial confidence. The Great Hall that dominates the ground floor, with its coffered ceiling decorated with gilded merchant marks and naval motifs, provides a setting for entertainments that bring together commercial partners, government officials, and foreign dignitaries in carefully orchestrated social events that advance business interests through the rituals of hospitality and conversation. The libraries that occupy prominent positions in these merchant palaces serve multiple functions that extend far beyond personal education or literary pleasure. Housing collections that support the information gathering and analysis, essential for successful international commerce, while also providing impressive settings for meetings with visitors whose cooperation or goodwill may be worth thousands of pounds in increased profits or avoided losses. Thomas Papillon's library, its shelves reaching from floor to ceiling and filled with works in 6 languages, contains not just classical texts in contemporary literature, but commercial manuals, legal treatises, and geographical surveys that provide the knowledge base necessary for conducting business across multiple jurisdictions and cultures. The globes, maps, and scientific instruments that decorate these scholarly spaces serve both practical and symbolic purposes, demonstrating the global reach of English commerce while providing tools for the planning and coordination of international ventures. The private offices and counting rooms that these merchant princes maintain within their domestic spaces reflect the integration of family and business life that characterizes successful commercial dynasties, where domestic arrangements must accommodate the requirements of international business while also providing the privacy and security necessary for protecting commercial secrets and conducting sensitive negotiations. Sir William Petty's study, hidden behind a false wall in his mansion's library, contains the most sensitive documents relating to his government connections and colonial investments, while its secret entrance allows him to meet with agents and informants without alerting household staff or casual visitors to the nature of his activities. The elaborate security measures that protect these private business spaces, including hidden safes, coded locks, and concealed escape routes, reflect both the value of the information they contain and the dangerous nature of some commercial activities. The elaborate dining rooms that serve as venues for the entertainment and cultivation of business relationships demonstrate how domestic hospitality becomes a form of commercial investment, where the quality of food, wine, and service reflects not just personal taste, but calculated strategies for impressing visitors and facilitating the kind of relaxed conversation that can lead to profitable partnerships or valuable information. The Chinese porcelain that graces these tables, the Turkish carpets that warm these floors, and the French wines that fill these cellars represent not just luxury consumption, but sophisticated understanding of international markets and trade relationships that inform investment decisions worth thousands of pounds. The entertainment of foreign merchants, government officials, and colonial administrators in these domestic settings creates opportunities for information gathering and relationship building that would be impossible in more formal, commercial, or political environments. The portrait galleries that line the corridors and reception rooms of these merchant palaces create visual narratives of family achievement and commercial success that serve both personal satisfaction and public relations purposes, demonstrating to visitors the stability and prosperity of the families they are dealing with, while also asserting claims to social status that challenge traditional distinctions between noble and commercial achievement. The portraits of successful ancestors, ships in foreign harbors, and exotic locations where family business interests extend create environments that remind visitors of the global reach and historical depth of English commercial power, while also providing conversation starters that can lead to discussions of mutual business interests. The gardens and grounds that surround these urban palaces provide not just recreational space, but also opportunities for private conversations away from the possibility of eavesdropping by servants or competitors, while their elaborate landscaping and exotic plantings demonstrate both wealth and global connections that support claims to social prominence and commercial sophistication. The orangeries and greenhouse facilities that many wealthy merchants construct allow them to cultivate tropical plants and fruits that provide both personal pleasure and business intelligence. A successful cultivation of colonial crops in English conditions can inform decisions about plantation investments and agricultural innovations in distant territories. The domestic chapels that wealthy merchant families maintain within their residences serve religious, social, and political purposes that extend far beyond family devotional needs, providing venues for discreet meetings with foreign visitors whose religious affiliations might make public association politically difficult, while also demonstrating the piety and moral seriousness that enhance commercial reputation and social standing. The furnishings and decoration of these private religious spaces, often including expensive imported materials and artwork, represent substantial investments that reflect both genuine devotion and calculated display of wealth and taste that can influence business relationships and social acceptance. The elaborate, stable facilities that support these merchant households reflect not just the practical requirements of urban transportation, but also the social and commercial importance of maintaining impressive equipages that enhance family status while providing secure and comfortable transportation for business meetings and social obligations that may be worth thousands of pounds in commercial advantages. The coaches and horses that fill these stables represent capital investments equivalent to ships or warehouses, while the liveries and equipment that outfit them create employment for craftsmen and suppliers whose loyalty and discretion may be as valuable as their professional skills. The servant quarters and domestic offices that occupy the upper floors and basement levels of these merchant palaces house staffs whose size and specialized skills reflect both the complex requirements of managing international business interests and the social expectations that accompany great wealth, while also providing opportunities for employment and advancement that attract talented individuals whose skills and connections can benefit their employers. Commercial interests. The secretaries, translators, and accountants who serve these merchant families often possess language skills, cultural knowledge, and professional connections that make them valuable assets in international business operations, while their loyalty and discretion become essential elements in maintaining the security and effectiveness of commercial activities. The wine cellars and food storage facilities that occupy the basement levels of these merchant mansions reflect both the requirements of elaborate entertainment and the practical benefits of bulk purchasing and storage that can provide both economic advantages and insurance against supply disruptions that might affect household operations or business activities. The rare wines and exotic foods stored in these facilities represent not just luxury consumption, but also commercial intelligence about foreign markets and trade opportunities, while their impressive scale demonstrates the wealth and foresight that enhance commercial reputation and social standing.